In our lesson today, we would be discussing qualitative research methods. As we speak about qualitative research methods are the type of data collection or the methods where non-numerical data is focused on. So the research method where you collect non-numerical data, we refer to that as qualitative research methods. Now, about this qualitative research methods, we would specifically be referring to the primary sources of qualitative data. Now, about these primary sources of qualitative data, in today's lesson, we would be discussing four different type of qualitative interviews. Now, let me remind you all, we have already discussed structured interviews. That is an example of quantitative, that's an example of primary source of quantitative data. However, when you talk about semi-structured interviews, or we talk about unstructured interviews, or we talk about group interviews, or for the matter of fact, focus groups, they're all examples of primary sources of qualitative data. Now, let's begin with this. But before we begin, I'd like to show you all the few questions that we've had. I'd rather say more than few questions that we've had on these particular type of interviews in the last 3 years. So if I talk about these questions here, in May, June 2021, we had an evaluative essay question that says, evaluate the use of qualitative interview methods in sociological research. This happens to be a 26-mark question. Moving on, in May, June 2021, we have variant 1.3. We have another question that reads, explain two strengths of structured interview. Okay, so this question is an example of quantitative interview. Quantitative interview, under the words primary source of quantitative interview. I'd like to remove this from here so that there's no confusion. Now, taking this ahead, we have had another question in November 2021, variant 1.1, and the question over here reads, describe two types of qualitative interview. Another question to follow in November 2021, 1.3, that's the same question, describe two types of qualitative interview. This question, they're both the same, variant 1.1 and variant 1.3. Taking it ahead, we have had a question in May, June 2022, variant 1.1, and the question over here reads, explain one strength and one limitation of unstructured interviews as a research method. This is a 6-mark question. Moving on, we've had another question in May, June 2022, variant 1.3, and this question reads, evaluate the view that qualitative interviews have little value in sociological research. Followed by another question in November 2022, variant 1.2, and the question reads, evaluate the view that qualitative methods provide the best way to study social behavior. Another 4-mark question in November 2022, variant 1.3, the question over here reads, describe two secondary sources of qualitative data. Another question in May, June 2023, variant 1.3, and this question reads, evaluate the view that qualitative interviews are a better method than questionnaires for studying society. November 2023, variant 1.2, explain two limitations of structured interviews. This again does not fall into this particular category. This we'd like to refer to as an example of quantitative data. And I'd like to remove this from here. In May, June 2024, variant 1.1, question 2b, the question reads, explain two strengths of group interviews as a research method. And in May, June 2024, variant 1.3, explained two limitations of group interviews as a research method. In this question, the examiner is expecting us to write down two strengths. In this question, the examiner is expecting us to write down two limitations. Now, I hope this was enough to let everyone know that this is a topic that you wouldn't want to miss on. So our focus today would be on these four different type of interviews. To name them, semi-structured interviews, unstructured interviews, group interviews, and focus groups. Taking this ahead, if we start off with semi-structured interviews. Now, when we talk about semi-structured interviews, how are semi-structured interviews different from structured interviews? When you talk about structured interviews have a formal structure. Structured interviews have the same questions listed down. Many people refer to structured interviews as an example of a formal verbal questionnaire too. However, as we speak about semi-structured interview, this word semi-structured in itself allows us or lets us know that there's flexibility over here. So we're talking about a questionnaire over here that would have questions listed down. So we're talking about a questionnaire that would have questions listed down, but the researcher, that is the interviewer, would have the option available of adding or subtracting questions from it. So we're talking about a list of questions that are preset, that are already there. But if the researcher feels like he or she wants to add up another question to it, he or she may. And if a researcher at any given point feels like he or she wants to remove any particular question from that particular set of questions, they're allowed to do that as well. So this particular type of interview allows researcher or the interviewer with more of flexibility. And this flexibility that the interviewer has over here allows him or her to be able to probe into question. Now let's just say if I'm an interviewer over here, I have a list of questions. Question number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So I have these list of 9 questions. If I feel like I want to add up more, I want to add up more, I want to know more, I want to rather say probe more, based on the answer that I've received from the respondent for question number 3, I would be allowed to add up another tiny little question to this, but then I'd be expected to get back to what I was doing from question number 4 onwards. Likewise, if I feel like as a researcher that question number 6 does not go in line with a particular participant, I have the option of letting go of question number 6 and not asking it at all. So when you talk about semi-structured interviews, I hope everyone's done copying this down. As we speak about semi-structured interviews combine preset questions with the flexibility to probe deeper. So they combine preset questions. So we're talking about preset questions over here, and they give the researcher the flexibility or allow the researcher the flexibility to be able to probe deeper into a particular subject matter. So this particular type of interview is also referred to as a balance between structure and depth. Structure brings standardization, depth adds to the validity or the accuracy of your research findings. Now, talking about semi structured interviews have their own strengths and limitations both. To begin with, if I talk about strengths of semi structured interviews over here, if I talk about the strengths of semi structured interviews, or if you want to save yourself some time, you might as well just put the heading strength and continue. So the first trend that I'd like to bring in under discussion over here is the structured consistency, the balance between, rather say, the balance between a structured consistency and the researcher, the interviewer having the option of exploring more depth or detail. So is often referred to as a balance. I mean, this is pretty much the same. So this is always seen as a balance between structured consistency and depth, that is detail. You have an option of getting details through this. Number two, another strength that I would like to bring in under discussion, this particular type of interview, that is a semi-structured interview, allows comparisons between respondents while while you're expecting certain unexpected themes as well, of course, based on the response that you've received from the interviewee. So this allows comparisons between respondents to some extent. Number three, this would help the interviewer, I like to say the flexibility helps interviewer. The flexibility helps the interviewer build rapport, which might encourage participants or respondents to give honest answers. If we move on towards the limitations of this particular type of interview, this particular type of interview has its own limitations as well, or has its own weaknesses as well. Now, of course, when there's flexibility, you are to some degree or the other compromising on the structure. So the structure or the standardized or the standardization rather might be compromised. Of course, if you're talking about two respondents over here, respondent number one, respondent number two, if because of the flexibility that you had, you might end up asking, let's just say, 7 questions from this respondent, and you might end up asking 9 questions from this one. Now, again, the extent to which you could have used a structured and a standardized approach to interviewing gets compromised if you compare this with a structured interview. Number one. Number two, these type of interviews might be time consuming when it comes to analysis. Of course, it would be time consuming because, like I said, for the sake of an example, again, if one respondent is answering to 7 questions and the other one is responding to 9 questions, you compare like with like. Taking this ahead, this might be time consuming to conduct and analyze. The word over here is rapport, RAPPORT. Now, getting back to where we were, number three, another limitation to this these type of interviews, they're more prone to interviewer bias. I mean, a researcher or an interviewer by the end of the day is a human being too. If, let's just say, this is interviewer, the interviewer might end up being nice towards one participant and not nice towards other. So there's always a possibility over there. Taking this ahead, so these type of interviews, they're more prone to interviewer bias because the follow-up questions may influence the responses. Another disadvantage to this, there, of course, less standardize, and I mean, I could just add this up over here also. This could lower reliability. What does the word reliability mean over here? A reliable research is a research that is conducted more than once and you end up receiving the same responses. So a research that you've conducted more than once and you come up with the same conclusions, you refer to that particular type of research as a reliable research. Of course, for you to be expecting the same responses, you ought to be asking the same questions. However, with the amount of flexibility that the researcher has, especially when you talk about these questions, it always, the flexibility comes with a price over here, and the researcher might not be able to might not be able to compare the responses between two participants. Now, the researcher might not be able to compare the responses between two participants very well because the questions they were asked were not the same. So, the standardization of this particular type of interview might be compromised, which eventually results to lowering of reliability. Now, taking this a little further, we could add up a few sociological references to this as well, just in case. The popular feminist Anne Oakley in 1981 used semi-structured interviews. One of the few names that I suggest students should be memorizing, because one, Oakley is popular. Number two, Anne Oakley's reference can be used at multiple places. So she used this while studying motherhood, just in case if you seek more of information on this. And she felt the personal insights that an individual might be able to gain through semi-structured interview is something that the structured interview does not allow. Because you see, structured interviews, they're seen by many as a very robotic type of interview. Now, I wouldn't advise you to use the word robotic if you're writing an answer. Just for the sake of an explanation here, it's the same questions, the same amount of questions being asked every participant. And this it doesn't really allow you to build that rapport. It doesn't really allow you to build that relationship with the respondents. So if you're comparing structured interviews with with a semi-structured interview, or for the matter of fact with an unstructured interview, like Oakley suggests, semi-structured interviews, they allow you to build that rapport. They allow you to explore personal insights, which often structured interviews miss out. So another reference that you would come across while preparing yourself for paper 2, this research was conducted by Michael Young and Peter Wilmot in 1973, and they tend to have combined preset questions to study family life in London. Now, this particular research that we're referring to, this combined both quantitative and qualitative data. So it's on your discretion. You want to use this reference, you may. You don't want to use this reference, it's again on your discretion. They combined quantitative and qualitative data. So yeah, I hope this was understood by you all. I'd like to now move on to unstructured interviews. And when we speak about unstructured interviews are informal. Unstructured interviews are informal. Unstructured interviews are seen by many as open-ended conversations where the researcher usually follows the participant's lead. Now, what does it mean when the researcher actually follows the participant's lead? What I mean over here is that the participant, that is the interviewee, is allowed to speak in a very informal manner. It's more like a casual conversation that is usually guided. That's an informal conversation that's usually guided, because the researcher or the interviewer would not want the interviewee, that is the respondent, to to get off track. So yeah, these particular type of interviews that are unstructured interviews, they are known for their they're known for their informal nature. It could probably be something, or it could probably be a discussion over a particular topic in a very relaxed environment where there is less of formality that is involved. These types of interviews, they are seen by many as free flowing interviews. And it's more like, in many situations it is something like this, that there would just be this interviewer and there would be this interviewee, and let's just say they have a table in front of them and there's a cup of coffee and they're just having a very relaxed conversation. So what usually happens is the researcher, that is the interviewer, would put up a topic, and the interviewee, that is the respondent, would be allowed to speak about that particular topic. Let's just say there's this particular topic that they have put up here, and based on this particular topic, there's this conversation that goes on and on and on. So the interview just shares the topic, and whatever the interviewee's perception is, whatever the interviewee's perspective is on that particular topic, is discussed, not even discussed, because I'd rather say the interviewee is given an option of speaking whatever they feel like about that particular topic. So yeah, we're talking about unstructured interviews over here. Unstructured interviews are informal, they're open ended conversations where the researcher follows the participant's lead, allowing for in depth exploration of their perspective. So you get to have in depth knowledge on a particular subject matter or on a particular topic. So you get to you usually expected as a researcher to allow the respondent, to allow the interviewee to say whatever he or she wants to say about that particular topic. So yeah, unstructured interviews, like I had said earlier, they're more like guided informal conversations. They're more like guided informal conversations. They are flexible and they're free flowing, and they usually take place in a very relaxed environment. Taking this a little further, if we talk about interview process, the interview process of unstructured interviews. Now, these particular type of interviews, for these interviews, the interviewer needs to be highly trained. The interviewer needs to be highly trained for these particular type of interviews. Let's just say if this is the interviewer needs to be skilled, the interviewer needs to be trained. So you ought to have a trained interviewer. You ought to have a trained interviewer here. The interviewer needs to be highly skilled, because you want to conduct effective interviews, because you want your data collection procedure to be effective. These are expected to be non-directive. That is, you're expected to avoid using leading questions, avoid leading questions. For the ones who do not know what leading questions are, when you are deliberately, I mean, could be deliberate or could be unintentional, both. When your question is phrased in a manner that it suggests a particular answer, when your question is phrased in a manner that when your question is phrased in a manner that it suggests a particular response or a particular answer, you refer to that particular type of question as a leading question. So, researchers or the interviewers in this case are expected to be non-directive. They're expected to not let the participants feel like they're expected to give a particular response. So, a leading question is a question that is phrased in a manner that you give a particular response. So, you are expected to phrase your questions in a manner that does not suggest any particular response. So, we're talking about how the interviewer needs to be trained, the interviewer needs to be highly skilled, because highly skilled, also because you do not want the interviewer to tap into something that he or she shouldn't, because you don't want to, I mean, it you need to be super careful when it comes to dealing with what do you call it, you need to be super careful when it comes to dealing with what do you call it, with sensitive topics. That also has to be kept in mind. So the interviewer needs to be trained to minimize interviewer bias. They're trained to minimize interviewer bias. The researchers are expected to establish a rapport between with the interviewee. Now, why is it that this is considered important? This is considered important because if the participant does not feel at ease, I mean, you ought to be friendly, you ought to make the participant feel comfortable. I mean, you need to build that trust and relationship with the participant so that the participant is showing readiness towards sharing what you want them to share with you, so that you actually have an insight to what the participant feels about a particular subject matter. So these are a few instructions that are typically given to interviewers. They're expected to be trained, they're expected to be highly skilled, because you want the interview process to be highly effective. They're expected to be non-directive, that is, they're expected to avoid asking leading questions. They're trained to minimize interviewer bias. They're expected to establish a rapport between with the participant, that is the interviewee. And for this, they uh, they conduct their interview in a very friendly atmosphere. Now, about the strengths and weaknesses of unstructured interviews, to begin with, if we start off with the strengths of unstructured interviews, structured interviews are known to produce rich qualitative data that helps uncover complex social phenomena. Now, could be any it could be any taboo, could be any topic that people in a particular community or a particular society usually avoid. This very flexible, this very friendly, this very informal nature of an unstructured interview allows the a researcher to be able to gather data that might help uncover something that might not have been uncovered before, that might not have been studied before. There's always a possibility. Number one. Number two, the informal nature, of unstructured interviews encourage participants to share openly. Now, these unstructured interviews, we see these particular type of interviews being supported by interpretivists. They are favored by interpretivists. Now, remember when we were discussing positivism and when we had compared positivism with interpretivism, I had discussed how positivists support the idea of using quantitative data for a particular sociological research. And interpretivists, on the other hand, they advocate the usage of qualitative data instead. So, quantitative data, an example for this would be structured interviews. And for qualitative data, an example of this could be unstructured interviews. So interpretivists tend to be supporting the idea of using unstructured interviews because of the detailed insight you might gain on a particular subject matter. Now, if we hop on to the limitations to the usage of unstructured interviews, they're very time consuming. They're very time consuming because it takes you time to build that relationship with the respondent. You want to build that relationship with the respondent because you want the respondent to speak to you in a very comfortable and an open and an honest manner. Building relationship takes time. They are criticized for being less reliable. They criticize for being less reliable because the questions aren't the same. In fact, if you remember, what I'd said was the researcher typically just puts the topic in front of the respondent and then allows and then encourages the respondent to speak. The respondent gets to speak at his or her own will. They say what they feel like saying, but at the same time, the researcher, that is the interviewer, wants to try to the best of his or her capacity or capability to get the most out of that conversation, to actually tap into what they want to tap into, with at the same time being trained and skilled enough to minimize interviewer bias, being trained and skilled enough to avoid asking leading questions. So this type of interview, like any other interview, is always prone to, or let's just use the word maybe, these type of interviews may also be affected by interviewer bias. The interviewers, uh, the interviewers' social class, interviews gender, interviews ethnicity, uh, interviews education, interviewers, uh, what do you call it? Personality, body language, demeanor, likability, facial expressions, eye contact. All of this could eventually affect the responses that you receive from the interviewee. I mean, imagine if a particular interviewer is too intimidating, the respondent might not feel very comfortable. Now, we were just discussing a couple of strengths and limitations of the usage of unstructured interview in a sociological research. Number one, to begin with, unstructured interviews are an example of qualitative interviews. They're an example of primary sources of qualitative data, that is, qualitative interview. Talking about the strengths and limitations over here, unstructured interviews, like I said, produce rich qualitative data, and this rich qualitative data helps uncover certain complex social phenomena which might not have been spoken about before. Now, for instance, there was a study that was conducted by Smith et al. In the year 1988. This study was about the family background of homeless young people, and the in-depth information that was received from this particular research was perhaps only possible because of the very informal nature of this particular type of interview. Again, the second, this goes pretty, this example that I gave of this research that was conducted by Smith et al. In 1998 pretty much goes in line with the second strength that we have written down over here, that says the informal nature of unstructured interviews encourage participants to share openly. The third point, in unstructured interviews are favored openly by interpretivists, because guess what? Interpretivists support the idea of collecting qualitative data. According to interpretivists, the detailed insights that are gained out of unstructured interviews on any particular subject matter, they are a lot better than the statistical data that a structured interview could have uh, helped gather. Now, moving on to the weaknesses, to the cons, to the limitations of the usage of unstructured interviews. To begin with, these interviews are very time consuming. They're very time consuming while conducting, and they're even more time consuming when it comes to data analysis. Now, there's a possibility that the interviewee might end up talking about stuff that isn't even in line with your topic. I mean, as much as the researcher, the interviewer would want to not allow the respondent to get off track. The You don't, as a researcher, you don't want your respondent to get off track, but at the same time, you know for a fact that you wouldn't want to snap at the interviewee and ask them to, I mean, give them a shut up call. Maybe you wouldn't want to do that, because you are trying to build a relationship with them, a relationship that is built with the intention of being able to gain more and a better and a detailed insight into the particular subject matter, which the interviewee might not have spoken about, might not have wanted to discuss if the setting or if the setting of this particular type of interview was formal. Number two, the second limitation that we have for this is, before I hop onto the second limitation, remember when I just said that it is time consuming even when it comes to data analysis. You, while analyzing your data, you might realize that the data is literally all over the place. You've gained so much of data, and I mean, you've gathered so much of data. If you were using a recorder there, of course with the permission of the interviewee, you might realize that you've gained so much of data and you don't even know what to do with it. And a lot would have to be omitted a lot of discussion, a lot of stuff that was said by the interviewer by the sorry interview might not even be of any use to you. So data analysis is a pretty time consuming phase that interviewers or researchers go through if they're using unstructured interviews. Number two, the second limitation over here, the uh, idea that because unstructured interviews, they're not formal, because they're not structured, you don't even know what the questions would be like. Or in fact, it wouldn't be wrong to say you avoid using questions because you're just allowing the researcher to the respondent to speak. All you've done is put up a topic in front of them. So these type of interviews, they seem to be less reliable because their questions aren't the same. The responses or the answers wouldn't be the same either. The third limitation that we could use over here is about is it's a very let's just say a general is of a very general nature. So the interviewees might be affected because of interviewer bias, because of status differences. Like I said, the color, creed, nationality, religion, political predisposition, social class, gender, ethnic origin, so on and so forth. There's so much that might affect the responses that you receive from the respondent. Now, I would like to move on and discuss a couple of sociological examples of using unstructured interviews. This is the example I was giving a few minutes ago. So this was a sociological example of using unstructured interview. I could say, let's just say a suggestion for using unstructured interviews. You could simply put a heading that says suggestions. A relatively recent reference here. Edwards and Holland, they emphasized that Listening is the key to probing and following up participants. So the focus is on listening. In other words, allow the respondent to speak. Make the respondent or the interviewee feel empowered. Let's just call this suggestions. Let's add up one more to this. Number two, according to Fielding in the year 1993, interviewers should be careful and avoid leading questions to ensure the responses received from participants are not to ensure the responses received by received received from participants aren't influenced. So, two major suggestions. Edwards and Holland in 2013 emphasized that listening is the key to probing and following a participant's responses. The key word over here is to listen. Allow the participant to speak so that the participant feels empowered. When the participant would feel empowered, they would speak more. When they would speak more, they would provide you more of information. And according to Fielding in 1993, interviewers should be careful and should avoid using leading questions. Avoid using leading questions to ensure that the responses you receive from the participants aren't influenced. Now, this has taken a lot more time than I thought it would. To remind you all, we were discussing qualitative interviews. We were discussing there are four different qualitative interviews that we uh, typically learn when preparing research method paper one, and they are: number one, semi-structured interviews; number two, unstructured interviews; number three, group interviews; number four, focus groups. So in this lesson, I towards the beginning I had shown you the type of questions that we've had on these four different type of interviews, on these four different type of qualitative interviews rather. And I had wanted to ideally cover group interviews and focus groups in this particular lesson too, but I think I'd have to have another lesson, a tinier one maybe, that focuses, or rather say that covers group interviews and focus groups. So yeah, I hope this was helpful.